Will not send any diplomatic or official representation to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics and Paralympic Games, given the PRC's ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses. The athletes on Team USA have our full support. We will be behind them 100% as we cheer them on from home. We will not be contributing to the fanfare of the Games.
Okay, so it's a sort of boycott. The United States, in terms of the Beijing Games, the American athletes will go, but American government officials will not. The move is in response to China's human rights abuses. So what will Canada do? Rob Oliphant is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he is in Ottawa. Mr. Oliphant, good to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Hello, David. How are you today?
I'm good. You going to Beijing?
Personally, I expect I won't be going to Beijing. But I will be cheering on our athletes, I am sure, whenever I get a chance.
Okay, and what about other cabinet colleagues? Will they be going?
I think that decision is still being made. Obviously, we're aware of the American decision. We were given a heads up about that. We respect their ability and their capacity to make those decisions on their own. We have an independent foreign policy. We're engaged in conversations with our allies and like-minded countries around the world. And there will be a decision that will be made, which will be in the best interest of Canadians and Canada.
When?
I'm not privy to when yet. I think that diplomacy takes time, and making sure that we talk with all our like-mindeds. And I think, and your last guest mentioned the release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. That was done, yes, obviously by Ambassador Barton and the mission in Beijing. It was done with help from the embassy in Washington that we worked through. But it was also done because we amassed one of the largest collections of like-minded countries to continue to put either very direct pressure on China or very quiet behind-the-scenes pressure on China. And I think that proved that when we work in concert with allies, many of them, the United States, but others as well, we can be successful.
The House of Commons, in which you sit, has declared what is happening to the Uyghur Muslims a genocide. What makes this decision so difficult?
I was in the House that day. I voted for that as Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Governments have different responsibilities, and so they were watching that decision, but the Parliament has spoken. It is still, however, a complex relationship that we have with China. And it's an important relationship we have with Olympic athletes who are training their hearts out and their bodies out to make sure that they perform well. So we're taking this very seriously, very cautiously. We've stood up for Uyghur population in Xinjiang very strongly at the UN Human Rights Council. We've led the way with other like-minded countries on that issue. We will continue to do that, as we will speak for democracy and human rights in Tibet or in Hong Kong, as well as human rights in Tibet. We'll continue to do that. Each way we talk about the challenge of a difficult relationship with an important country like China, and we don't want to we don't want to take any decision quickly. We want to take them carefully.
I'm hoping you could expand a bit more on what you call the important but complex relationship with China. So there are, as you and I speak, there are Canadian firms where China is the biggest customer or where they source virtually all of their product out of China. Beyond that, what is the complexity of it?
Well, it is a complex relationship. We have farmers in Western Canada and throughout Canada, whether they're beef producers or pork producers or cherry growers, who depend on those markets. Those are important to us, as well as I look around my own home and I see products made from China. That's a reality of our life. We live in an interdependent world, and we want to be careful.
So are you worried that those supply lines would be disrupted if Canada were to take a diplomatic action?
That's not the deciding factor whatsoever. The deciding factor is what is best for Canada's participation at the Olympics, mindful of Olympic athletes who are training and working hard, and mindful also of sending important signals to China, as we have been doing for the last several years. Important signals about human rights, about democracy, and about the liberty of their own people, as well as the international rules-based order. Of course, we have companies that are affected. That's not the dominant factor. The dominant factor will always be the best interest of Canada and Canadians, and we'll keep doing that carefully and steadily.
The person speaking for Canada, of course, in Beijing, Dominic Barton, right now, the ambassador has announced that he will leave at the end of this year. In 2022, at the beginning of the new year, do you expect that Canada will have a new ambassador in place?
Well, first, let me tip my hat to the tremendous work that Ambassador Barton has done for Canada. He has been an outstanding diplomat. I may disagree with your previous guest on the different gifts that different people bring to our diplomatic corps around the world. Dominic Barton brought an intense and intimate, strong knowledge of China and the Chinese people, and he used that to benefit Canada. And so I will, for one, be missing him as a representative of Canada in the world, particularly in Beijing. There will be a process, and we've had times when we've not had an ambassador. We've had a charge d'affaires in the past. We have a brilliant, I would say no less than brilliant staff in Beijing and around China in our consulates. Mm-hmm. They will continue to safeguard Canadian interests, and we'll have a new ambassador in due course.
And in that consideration, in due course, are you looking at a career diplomat, or are you looking at somebody like the past ambassador, the current ambassador who comes out of the business world?
The Prime Minister will make that decision with the advice from Global Affairs Canada. We'll get the best person for the job at this time. The context constantly shifts in any country. We want to make sure we have the right set of skills at the right time with the right person to represent Canada. That person needs to be strong. They need to stand up for human rights. They need to protect Canadian interests, business interests, as well as personal interests of Canadians who travel back and forth. We want someone who is clearly articulate on issues like arbitrary detention and other issues that we have spoken out on in the world. We'll be looking for the best possible person to represent Canada in a complex, difficult, challenging position.
Finally, I want to talk to you about Huawei. I'm just waiting for your face to fall, that's all.
Nothing at all. No, this is a decision. Obviously, Canadians are waiting. I'm waiting.
And has been waiting for quite some time, right? It's been a long time. Like every other country has made their decision, and Canadian companies have effectively had to make a decision by saying, okay, there's all this uncertainty, so we're just not going to use Huawei out of fear that we might be forced to strip it out.
Canada's decision is forthcoming, obviously. We've signaled that. You'll be the first to hear. David, I promise you'll be the first to hear when that decision is made. It'll be made to safeguard, protect the safety and security of Canadians and our electronic lives. We'll make sure we do what is best for Canada on that, and we're going to do it carefully. Other countries, yes, some have acted already, some have not acted. Canada has an independent foreign policy. We talk with our neighbors, we talk with our allies and partners, but we'll make that decision. It'll be the best decision to safeguard Canadian interests in Canada and around the world.
Rob Oliphant, very good of you to make time today. Thank you.
Great to hear you and see you again.
And during the pandemic, anti-Semitic attacks have increased. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently reappointed Irwin Cotler as Canada's special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. He is in Montreal. Mr. Cotler, it's always good to have you on the program, and I want to spend most of our conversation talking about your important work at combating anti-Semitism, but I would be remiss if I didn't start our conversation by talking to you about China, which is in the news today. A decision by the Biden administration to not send any diplomats, not to have any high-profile contacts with the Chinese during the Beijing Games. Do you think that that's something that Canada should mirror, and if so, why?
I think Canada should mirror. I've actually been a long-time advocate initially for relocating the Games. I still recall 1936, the Games of Shame in Hitler's Germany, and I felt that the CCP should not be rewarded for its, among other things, mass atrocities that constitute acts of genocide. That was a reason given by the Biden administration, among others. And I think that Canada should also engage in such a diplomatic boycott. Indeed, I would hope that the community of democracies would engage in it. And the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, of which I'm the co-chair for Canada, has advocated that as well.
You've spoken at length in the past about Uyghur Muslims and the treatment at the hands of the Chinese government. How would you characterize that?
Well, I would characterize those mass atrocities as acts constitutive of genocide. That's not a word I used lightly or easily, but in fact, our Raoul Wallenberg Center produced a report on that, which in fact was endorsed by 50 of the leading scholars on genocide and international law specialists. So these are acts that are constitutive of genocide. Even if we use the term crimes against humanity, that would be reason enough for a diplomatic boycott. And let's not forget that we have the other human rights abuses, whether it be the assault not only on the democracy movement, but democracy in Hong Kong, the attempted persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong, the menacing of Taiwan, the repression of Tibet, what Xi Jinping has called the five poisons. They've been targeting those five poisons. We also forget that China has imprisoned more journalists than any other country in the world, as well as lawyers who would represent them. So there's reason enough here, certainly, for a diplomatic boycott.
While the scope and scale of what is happening inside China now does not compare, obviously, to what's happening in Canada, it's not to say that Canada is living some sort of perfect life either, and you would know that because of the work that you're doing around anti-Semitism. There have been an increase in the number of cases reported recently right across this country of anti-Semitic incidents, anti-Semitic attacks. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that we've had a number of tipping points with regard to that, but I think what we have to put it in context. In other words, anti-Semitism is the oldest, the longest, most enduring, and most lethal of hatreds. As Dr. Ahmed Shahid, my colleague, has put it, one that is toxic to democracies and the canary in the mineshaft of global evil. The two tipping points we had were the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, which I participated in as a member of the Canadian delegation in 2001, where that conference turned into one of racism and hatred against Jews and the Jewish people. The second was the recent Hamas-Israel war. That became a second tipping point where Jews were threatened and targeted in their neighborhoods and in the streets, in their communities, in the campuses. Synagogues were torched, Holocaust memorials defaced, synagogues, cemeteries desecrated, Jewish institutions vandalized. And this resulted in what you mentioned, the most alarming rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes ever. 2020 was the year for the most alarming rise, but by May 2021, we had reached that level, along with incendiary hate speech on the social media. So there's a confluence here of dynamics. And one of the things that has really concerned me has been the fact that we've noticed with regard to anti-Semitism, we used to say that we can combat the triangular or tripartite approach, anti-Semitism from the far right, anti-Semitism from the far left, and anti-Semitism from radical Islam. But the thing that has concerned me and that I've noticed increasingly has been what I would call the mainstreaming, the normalizing, the legitimation of anti-Semitism, increasingly in the political culture, and the absence of outrage and the indifference and inaction which underpins it, along with the globalization of this phenomenon, so that what happens in Paris and London reverberates in Montreal and Toronto, and in fact is indeed replicated. I was recently in London, which in May had convoys going through the streets saying, F your daughters will rape, F the Jews will rape your daughters. Similar convoy took place in streets in Canada. So we see this as part of an even orchestrated globalization. And then the third thing that I found, yeah.
Oh, I just want to jump in. I mean, it is one thing to call out the problem, and obviously that is important if you're going to confront it and to say here's where it is happening. And sometimes it is not as outright as what you're describing. But what can you do to combat that?
Well, I think number one, this is not something that Jews alone can combat. I think we have to realize, as I say, that it is toxic to our democracies, and therefore we have a collective responsibility as well as interest. I think education is crucial, not only education with respect to the Holocaust, but education with regard to the contemporary dynamics of anti-Semitism as well. We call the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil, but anti-Semitism paradigm for radical hate. I think allyship is important. The targeted minorities need to come together and work in concert. We have here systemic racism against Indigenous people, Blacks, people of color, Asian, Canadians, Muslims. We need to work in concert and in allyship in this regard. I also think that important that the community of democracies work in concert in this matter as well. And here to adopt the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism, which is not only the most authoritative, comprehensive, and indeed international definition we have, but the most representative, because it was democratically adopted over a 15-year period by intergovernmental bodies, governments, parliaments, civil society leaders, and the like. So that would give us a resource, an asset to help identify it, monitor it, and therefore we can more effectively combat it.
And you, as the special envoy to this government for the country on combating anti-Semitism, you have this specific connection with the federal cabinet. What is it that you're speaking to ministers about to help them in their work fighting this same problem?
Well, you know, when I was a minister, as a Minister of Justice, I noted that ministers have to work in concert on these issues. I launched then as a minister the National Justice Initiative against racism and hate. And so we need to have ministers of justice, of public security, diversity and inclusion, foreign policy, Canadian heritage. I've met with all of them because we need to work together in concert. We can't work in silos, and not only at the governmental level, but at the parliamentary level. And I hope to revive what I was engaged in when I was a parliamentarian, which is a Canadian parliamentary coalition to combat anti-Semitism, working along with other parliamentary coalitions internationally. And we have to, in particular, address and redress the anti-Semitism, as I mentioned, on the social media, because that is metastasizing and is having its fallout, particularly in terms of the targeting of the young. So that's some of the things that I have in mind. We need to work together, as I said, governments, parliaments, civil society, academics, and the like in concert. And just today I was on a webinar with students. The campus culture is particularly important in that regard, and we have to pay specific attention there as well.
And just to loop back very briefly to where we started, because you meet with cabinet ministers and you're talking about this important file and you have connections with this government, but you also have taken a position on the Beijing Olympics. If you were in front of a cabinet minister who was waffling right now about whether to go or not to go, what would you say?
I would say that we should, for the reasons I mentioned, that we should engage in a diplomatic boycott with respect to those Olympic Games. We should not allow these Olympic Games to become again the games of shame for China, to be incentivized in its impunity, and therefore they need to be held accountable. And a diplomatic boycott would only be one of the necessary initiatives we should be taking. There are several others which would include, among other things, having an independent, impartial, international investigation of what is happening with respect to the targeting of the Uyghurs and the mass atrocities there, which China has not yet permitted, imposed Magnitsky sanctions, etc. We need to take a leadership role along with the community of democracies to seek justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators.
Mr. Kotler, thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
Not at all. Always good speaking with you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.